From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, September 5th. For decades, we've read about China's one-child policy and the often traumatic impact it has had on the country's citizens, of the forced sterilizations and babies abandoned in orphanages. But now, decades after that policy was first put into place, China is battling a different problem, namely a fertility collapse that has led to a drastic decline in the economy and innovation. And now, the challenge to convince its citizens to have more babies. Today, North Asia correspondent Eryk Bagshaw on the Chinese CEO who's paying his employees $10,000 to have a baby, and how a collapse in China's fertility might impact the rest of us. So, Eryk, not long ago on Please Explain, we spoke with another colleague of ours about the problem of declining fertility in Australia and that a lot of young Australians are choosing to not have children. Today, though, I want to speak to you about where the problem of declining fertility is perhaps more pronounced than anywhere else, in China. So explain to me just how big a problem population decline is in China right now.
It's massive. It's the foundational issue in their economy. They are grappling with a fertility rate of 1.1. To give you context, Australia's is about 1.7. And that means that there's really only one person being born for every two people that are currently alive. And again, you put that in the context of China's 1.4 billion population, which was once the largest in the world. Now India's about to overtake it. You're looking at a decline of half that population potentially over the next 50 years, which means all the infrastructure you're building, all the investments you're making, all the real estate that's going up, they are seeing massive threats to their ongoing prosperity because, quite simply, young Chinese couples aren't interested in having babies. And it's because of the costs of education, it's because of the costs of housing, and it's because of the very long tail of the legacy of the one-child policy.
There are more than 1 billion Chinese. That one big statistic, more than anything else, is at the heart of that country's huge economic problems.
The one-child policy was really started under Mao. It began at least to be popularized from the 1960s onwards as a way of making sure that there was enough food to go around.
By the middle of the next century, if China's families have an average of 3 children, there will be starvation. However, with 1 child per family, the standard of living doubles.
But it wasn't really enforced until the 1970s and the 1980s when it became extremely strict and people were punished for having more than 1 child.
But the pain of the past policy is still bitterly felt. This mother was snatched at home by local officials and forced to be sterilized.
It meant that entire villages were policed by essentially this kind of mobs of Chinese Communist Party enforcers, and it had an unbelievably detrimental effect on the Chinese population. Some argue that it allowed people in China to grow rich faster because there were fewer mouths to feed and it had just come out of the Great Famine. But one of its perverse effects was that it geared society in China around 1 child, in that that child was the apple of the family's eye. All the resources were pulled into that child. They had to be seen as both highly educated, as musical, as athletic. And the reason that you have these enormous industries in China targeted around private education, tutoring, creating musical geniuses, is directly because of the one-child policy. And you had an enormous amount of money flowing into these industries, and it distorted the market. And it meant that today's parents are even less interested in having children, despite the fact there is no more one-child policy.
Okay, and you've spoken to one really interesting man who's taking it upon himself to try and fix this problem. Who is he?
James Leang grew up in China during the one-child policy, which he describes as an extremely unproductive event.
Of course, this is a huge problem for China, and this policy of fertility policy back 10 years ago was still doing one-child policy, which is hugely, unproductive event.
He saw what was happening with the one-child policy during the 1980s and the 1990s, and then moved to the United States for a period of time there.
10 years as CEO, I took a few years off to get a PhD in economics from Stanford, and my research area is innovation. And while I'm looking at innovation, I found that demographics is one of the big factors. And this is a very frontier research I found.
He is also a demographer. He has studied innovation, population research for the last couple of decades, and so has married his very large business interests with his personal and academic research in demography. And he has a profound interest in making sure that China's population does not decline further, because he thinks it's bad for the country, it's bad for the world, and it's bad for business. I think he's someone who's done very well in China, but has also wanted to bring with him some of the lessons he's taken from the West to see how it might be able to spur its own domestic growth.
And right now, James is embarking on an experiment to try and incentivize people in China to have babies. So tell me about that experiment.
So James Leang is the chairman of Trip.com, one of the world's largest travel agencies and indeed the biggest in China. And he's paying his employees $10,000 each time they have a child. So it's, kind of an extraordinary program, the first of its kind I can think of from private enterprise anywhere in the world. And then he's giving them a top-up every year for the first 5 years of their life of $2,500 per child. That's a very substantial amount of money when you've got something like 45,000 employees worldwide, many thousands of them in China. And he's doing it because he thinks the situation is urgent, and he wants to set an example for the Chinese government of how it might be able to boost fertility. And of course, in China, going that bold is not without its risk. Chinese businessmen do face challenges from the party, and particularly when they're implementing big, broad-range policies like this. But he knows that he's kind of at the forefront of a policy area that perhaps the party is happy to hear some debate ventilated on. Sometimes they just allow these valves to open and to get people's ideas out there. And so he's taking this kind of calculated step and decided that now is the time to move, because if it waits any longer, China's population rate could head further south of 1, meaning there is not even one baby being born per 2 people in China, a truly potentially catastrophic spiral that might see China's population decline even more steeply over the next 4 or 5 decades.
So just how much is this going to cost his company?
So James estimates it's going to cost about 1 billion yuan. So that's about $215 million. It's a massive amount for a private company to be investing in what is essentially a public policy.
I mean, that is a massive figure. So why do you think James's company would be willing to invest so much money in solving this problem? I mean, what is the fear if it isn't solved?
The ultimate fear, I think, within China is that it does not fulfill its potential of becoming the dominant superpower in the world. It was only 2 or 3 years ago that I was writing China was on track to overtake the US by the end of the 2020s as an economic superpower. Those forecasts have now been dashed. COVID put an end to that. It has a population that has passed the demographic dividend, which is essentially when there's more young people than there are old people. If you don't have enough young people, well, it's very difficult to innovate, as a lot of James's research shows. It's very difficult to generate the kind of competition that saw China, through companies like Alibaba, through Tencent, through Huawei, huge multinational companies that were built on the back of young Chinese people. If you're all of a sudden grappling with an economy that is just getting by because it's got to service its aged care, because it doesn't have enough people to support its older generations, enough young people to build its roads, enough young people to fill its schools, and you don't contemplate immigration, and because in East Asia, immigration on any large scale is really out of the question because they are still, well, really fundamentally ethnocentric and xenophobic societies, then you've got a real problem. And so baby making is really the only solution, and apparently $215 million worth of investment might, help with that process.
Eryk, what is the Chinese government doing right now to try and fix this problem? Does the Chinese Communist Party acknowledge that declining fertility rates are an issue?
It does, and it acknowledges it through reversing policies like the one-child policy. It went from one-child policy to the two-child policy, and then all of a sudden a three-child policy, which was met with kind of laughter and disdain across a lot of China, that all of a sudden they were going to start popping out 3 kids. To complement that, there are forms of cash subsidies, there are tax rebates. They banned the sort of private education after-school centres and weekend private education centres because they were seen as profiteering. The problem is the one-child policy is so entrenched this idea of having this perfect child that now you have underground tutors in China absolutely flourishing. And so all of these policies, have consequences and have had flow-on effects that are really, really tricky to shift.
Right. So the CCP is doing very little to solve the problem. So it falls on the shoulders of private enterprise and on people like James to step in. But Eryk, why would private enterprise take on this problem? What is in it for people like James?
Well, that's the question I think I put to him first, really. Why do you feel the need to step in to fix something that government should be fixing? And he called it, one of humanity's greatest challenges, and it was like he had this moral obligation to do it. But ultimately, if you're looking at it from a pure markets perspective, fewer people is less money. It's less people investing in real estate. It's less people investing in cars. If there's a kind of a sort of an age formula, if you will, that most people buy cars and homes in their 30s, right? If we're seeing a decline in population now, we're going to see a drop in the car and property market in 30 years. But people who are buying properties now, well, if they know that their property is going to decline in 30 years' time, then they're going to be more reluctant to buy the property now or spend less on that property now. Therefore, it's this sort of self-perpetuating cycle. And that's really problematic because particularly in China, where you've seen a real estate boom and bust now, part of that long-term calculation is exactly that. But also, and James, mentioned that people will keep travelling into their 60s and 70s. That is true. But ultimately, in an economy that is sort of falling from very high growth rates, people will travel less. And it may take more years for that to come through, but there is no doubt that business has an incentive here to at least keep the population stable. And, it's James's contention that the government isn't doing enough, and that's why private enterprise has to step in, and that's why he hopes other companies follow his lead, particularly in China.
And I wanted to speak to you about the flow-on effect of China's decreasing fertility on the rest of the world, because China is the world's second biggest economy. It's our most powerful neighbor in the region. What kind of consequences should we expect if James doesn't succeed in his mission, and if the CCP doesn't step in to address this problem, and if China's economy continues to crumble?
I think we'll see a declining China. We'll see a China that is not as big a player on the world stage because it doesn't have the economic drive to get it there. At the end of the day, China's goal is to both become the world's largest economy, to supersede the United States as the dominant superpower, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and to, perhaps one day take control of Taiwan. All of those things, I guess, are pretty abstract to fertility. But in a way, they are all interlinked, because if your economy is not doing well, then there is greater risk of internal unrest at home. If your economy is not doing well, then you have less money to finance your military operations. And if your economy is not doing well, then some of your foreign policy ambitions can be curtailed. For Australia, it's significant enough to be a concern in the next 20 to 30 years. If China's population continues to decline, then obviously as Australia's largest trading partner, it means they're buying things like less iron ore, less wine, less coal, less barley, all those products that, have been banned and unbanned by Beijing. And potentially for Australian exporters, that means a smaller market. Australia's shown that it's been very successful at diverting away from that market, but nonetheless, fewer consumers means less dollars, basically. But it also means that Australia might be able to diversify some of those supply chains and potentially to strengthen some of that diplomatic and economic cooperation in the region away from China. Economically, it's probably a bad news story for Australia. Diplomatically, they might be able to turn it into something that has a longer-term gain for Canberra.
Thank you, Eryk, for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance by David McMillan. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.